They found them in the cold English earth, a tangled mass grave of headless young men. 54 bodies thrown into a pit, their skulls stacked separately like grotesque trophies. This wasn't a battlefield burial. It was a calculated act of ultimate disrespect, designed to erase them from history. The initial reports called it a simple execution. But a closer look at the forensic evidence, specifically the faint cut marks on the vertebrae, reveals a truth far more disturbing. The sagas tell tales of heroic deaths, but they don't tell you this. They don't describe the sheer clumsiness, the hesitation, the intimate brutality of how these men actually died. The real horror isn't that they were killed, it's the methodical, personal way it was done. Why were they forced to face their killers? What does the anatomy of the wounds reveal about their final, terrifying moments? Keep watching as we uncover the forensic secrets that official history chose to pave over. To answer those questions, we have to go back to that day in Dorset, to the sound of a rumbling excavator grinding to a sudden, jarring halt. The workers who peered into the chalky soil that afternoon expected to find stone or clay, but instead they saw the unmistakable, pallid white of bone. The authorities were called, and soon the construction site was a crime scene, 1,000 years in the making. What the team from Oxford Archaeology slowly, painstakingly, began to uncover was a puzzle of horror. Imagine the meticulous process, brushing away centuries of dirt to reveal a jumble of limbs tangled with rib cages, hip bones pressed against shoulder blades. These men, forensic science would later prove, were stripped naked and thrown in like animal carcasses. There was no respect here, no ceremony, just cold, efficient disposal. But then there was the pile of skulls. The contrast was chilling, and it's a detail that official histories often omit. The chaos of the bodies spoke of rage, but the neat stack of 54 heads spoke of something else entirely. Of ritual, of a message carved in human bone meant to last an eternity. The initial carbon dating placed the remains squarely in the brutal heart of the Viking Age, a time of raids and bloodshed. But this scene didn't fit the typical narrative of a battle. The lack of defensive wounds suggested the men were captives, helpless. The bones in this pit can only tell us how they died. They can't tell us why they died this way. To understand that, to truly grasp the chilling logic behind this spectacle of brutality, we have to look beyond the grave. We must enter the world of the Vikings themselves, a world governed not by our laws, but by an iron-clad code of honor and a soul-destroying fear of its opposite. The real story begins not with a sword, but with a word: shame. Shame. To us, it's an emotion, a fleeting discomfort, but in the Viking world, shame was a terminal diagnosis. It was a tangible force, a social poison that could erase your entire existence long before your body died. Their entire society was balanced on a knife's edge of reputation. They had a word for it: drengskapar. It was more than just bravery in battle. It was a complex code of honor, fairness, integrity, and keeping your word. Your drengskapar was your net worth as a human being. Without it, you were nothing. A glorious death in battle was a transaction, buying you a place in the sagas and a seat in Valhalla. But to die without honor, or worse, to live without it, was to be a ghost in your own village. Imagine the sensory deprivation of being ostracized. The sudden silence when you enter a room, the averted eyes of old friends, the cold air where a greeting used to be. Merchants would refuse to trade with you. Your own family might look at you with contempt. This social death was often the prelude to a physical one. An outlaw, a man formerly stripped of his honor and legal protections, could be killed by anyone at any time without consequence. His killer would face no penalty. So how could a person's reputation be so completely and systematically annihilated? The answer isn't just in the heroic sagas. It's buried in the dry, legalistic text of Iceland's medieval law code, the Gragas, or the Grey Goose Laws. Reading it today, it feels less like a constitution and more like a chillingly precise instruction manual for dismantling a human life. Official histories love to focus on the axes and the longships, but they rarely show you this: the bureaucratic machinery of humiliation. Within these laws, we find the concept of neath. There's no perfect English translation. Think of it as scorn, villainy, or insult, but its power was absolute. To publicly accuse a man of cowardice, or worse, of unmanliness, what they called ergi, wasn't just slander. It was an act of profound social violence, a legal provocation so severe that the target was honor-bound to respond, often with an axe. But words were only the beginning. The architects of this brutal legal system knew that to truly destroy someone, the shame had to be made permanent. It had to be carved not just into the memory of the community, but into the flesh of the offender. The Graga specified, in cold, clinical detail, exactly how to mark a body to reflect a broken spirit, and the physical punishments they prescribed, designed as living symbols of humiliation, are more shocking than you might imagine. The Gragas was a weapon, and its targets were flesh and bone. It provided a horrifyingly specific menu of mutilations, each designed to inflict a precise degree of public shame, turning the human body into a walking billboard of its owner's crimes. The punishments began with symbols of manhood. For lesser offenses, the law prescribed shearing. Imagine being held down, the rough iron shears scraping against your scalp and jaw, hacking away your hair and beard, the very symbols of your strength, your age, your status in the community. You wouldn't just be embarrassed, you would be visibly diminished, marked as a lesser man for all to see, a walking target for scorn until it grew back. But for a thief, the mark had to be permanent. For them, the law prescribed branding. Picture the scene, as described in the law's dispassionate prose. The glowing orange of an iron pulled from the fire, the acrid smell of burning hair as it approaches your face, the hiss and smoke as it makes contact with your cheek. The pain would be blinding, a white-hot agony that would sear itself into your memory. But the true punishment would come in the weeks and months that followed. A permanent, puckered scar, an undeniable announcement to every stranger you ever meet that you are a criminal, that you cannot be trusted. Your own face becomes your prison. And then there was the final solution for certain thieves and sexual offenders. A punishment so absolute it is spoken of in the law with the same detached tone as a fine for livestock. The law calls it gelda. We call it castration. There's no lurid description in the text, only the cold, bureaucratic instruction. But think of the visceral reality. A man held down, a simple, unsterilized knife, the searing pain, the massive blood loss, the high probability of dying from infection in the days that followed. It was the ultimate physical and symbolic destruction of a man's identity, his lineage, and his future. A permanent, living death. But here is the truly chilling part. For all the clinical detail in these legal texts, direct archaeological evidence for these punishments is incredibly rare. Skeletons with these specific markings are almost never found. This suggests something even more sinister. The threat of the searing iron, the shearing blade, and the castrating knife was so powerful, it may have been enough. The horror was a constant, looming possibility. A system of control built on terror. This was the state-sanctioned machinery of shame, brutal and efficient. But the Vikings had other, older ways of destroying a person. Methods that didn't require a courtroom or a law book. They had rituals of personal hatred, curses made manifest that could poison a person's soul without ever leaving a physical mark. The law could unman you, but a powerful curse could unmake you entirely. The law could break your body. But it took a more personal touch to break a person's mind. And for that, the Vikings had a tool of exquisite psychological cruelty. A method of destruction that didn't require a courtroom or a law book. Can you imagine walking out of your home at dawn, the morning mist still clinging to the ground, and finding this waiting for you? A 9-foot hazel pole driven deep into the earth, impaled on its sharpened top, a freshly severed horse's head, its lips and nostrils stretched back by its own drying ligaments into a grotesque, silent scream, facing your door. The eyes, already clouding over, seem to stare right through you, a dead gaze full of malice. The air around it is thick with the coppery smell of blood. and the early buzzing of flies. This was the Nithstung, the scorn pole. This wasn't just a macabre display. It was a carefully constructed ritual weapon. As ancient texts like Egil's saga describe, the creator would carve runes into the wood, formalizing the curse, invoking dark magic and calling upon the spirits of the land themselves to drive the victim out, to bring them to ruin. It was a public declaration that you were no longer just a criminal, but a pariah, an enemy of the community, the land, and the gods. Every neighbor who saw it, every child who ran past it in fear, would become a participant in your humiliation. It was a weapon of pure psychological warfare, designed to make you feel hunted and hated in your own home. A constant, rotting reminder of your shame. And here is a chilling fact that historians rarely discuss. Despite being so vividly described in the sagas, not a single archaeological fragment of a Nithstung has ever been found. Not one. It was a terror designed to be ephemeral, to rot away and vanish into the soil, leaving only the poison of its memory behind. Its power wasn't in the wood or the bone, but in the minds of those who saw it. It was a ghost that haunted the entire community. This was humiliation as a psychological art form, ephemeral, symbolic, and deeply personal. But it raises a terrifying question. What happens when you take the symbolic, ritualistic hatred of the scorn pole and combine it with the permanent, physical brutality of the executioner's blade? What happens when the message is no longer carved in wood, but in human flesh and bone? You get something new, something far worse. You return to the cold earth of Dorset. You return to the pit, and so we return to the pit. We left it as a cold case, a 1,000-year-old mystery of headless men. But now, armed with an understanding of the Viking obsession with honor and their intricate science of shame, the scene begins to make a terrifying kind of sense. The first piece of the puzzle came not from an ancient text, but from the sterile quiet of a modern laboratory. Archaeologists analyzed the chemical isotopes locked within the enamel of the victim's teeth. It's a geological fingerprint, a permanent record of the water a person drank as a child, telling you exactly where they grew up. The results were undeniable, and they changed everything. These were not local men. They were all from Scandinavia. One man's chemical signature showed he grew up north of the Arctic Circle, traveling more than 1,000 miles from his icy home, only to end up naked and headless in a ditch in England. Suddenly, the motive clicks into place. This was not a random massacre. This was reprisal, a captured Viking raiding party entirely at the mercy of their Anglo-Saxon enemies. And their captors, having endured Viking raids for generations, knew their enemies' culture intimately. They knew that a simple death would be a mercy. They knew that to truly defeat a Viking, you couldn't just stop his heart. You had to destroy his name, his reputation, his very essence. Every action taken at this pit was a calculated move in this devastating game of humiliation. They stripped them naked, robbing them of their status as warriors and reducing them to mere flesh. They denied them a clean death, a warrior's right. They threw their bodies into the pit like refuse, denying them a proper burial. And then, the heads. Piling the 54 heads separately wasn't just a trophy. It was the final, brutal punctuation mark. It was a statement. This pit wasn't just an execution site. It was a massive, gruesome, human scorn pole. A warning to any other raiders who dared to sail for these shores, crafted from the bodies of their countrymen. The scale of this act is staggering. It's humiliation on an industrial scale. But the true extent of what happened that day, the intimate, personal horror of it, isn't just in the layout of the grave. It's written in the tiny, almost invisible scars left on their bones. The forensic report tells a story moment by moment, blow by blow. And that story, hidden from history for a millennium, is about to be told. The story of that day is not a saga, it's a forensic report. A cold, scientific document that, when you read between the lines, becomes a script of unimaginable terror. For years, the official narrative was simple: a mass execution of Viking prisoners. But the bones remember the details the history books left out, the parts that were too disturbing to pass into legend. The first clue was the weapon. The clean, sharp trauma on the bone was consistent, not with a heavy executioner's axe, but with a sword. A warrior's weapon. But these warriors were not delivering a warrior's death. Because the most significant finding, a detail that changes absolutely everything, was the position of the cuts. In a standard, merciful execution, the victim kneels, and the blow is delivered swiftly from behind to the back of the neck. But the forensic analysis of these vertebrae showed something else entirely. The sword cuts weren't on the back, they were on the front. Let the chilling reality of that sink in for a moment. These 54 men were forced to be on their knees, facing their killers, to watch the sword as it swung. This was not a clean execution. It was a bloody, personal, face-to-face butchering, and the executioners were not masters of their craft. The report details a scene of horrifying incompetence, or perhaps of calculated cruelty. The skeletons show hesitant, misplaced blows. One man was hacked at repeatedly, with at least 6 distinct sword blows striking his jaw. The base of his skull and his neck before the head was finally, mercifully, severed. Can you even begin to imagine the terror? Not one clean stroke, but a series of agonizing, clumsy chops, each blow a fresh burst of pain and fear. This wasn't justice. This was a slow, messy, agonizing spectacle of terror, designed to be as frightening and humiliating as possible for every single man who was forced to watch and wait his turn. Each botched blow was a message. Each mangled vertebra tells a story of absolute power, of a captor relishing the final moments of his captive's life, turning their death into the ultimate performance of dominance. This forensic reality, brutal and documented, was buried for 1,000 years. It's a truth more horrifying than many of the Viking legends we know. Which raises a disturbing question. If this is the level of cruelty that history forgot, what can we learn from the one punishment so monstrous, so infamous, that it has haunted our collective nightmares for centuries? We are talking, of course, about the legend of the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle. Even the name itself is chilling. Here, we leave the world of verifiable science, of carbon dating and forensic reports, and we enter the blood-soaked pages of the Norse sagas. We are now in the realm of legend, where the horror is not written on bone, but in the epic, poetic verse of the Viking age. This wasn't a punishment for a common thief. According to texts like the Heimskringla and the Orkneyinga saga, this was a fate reserved for the most hated of enemies. For kings and princes who had committed unforgivable offenses against the great Viking heroes, it was the ultimate act of vengeance. Famously performed by Ivar the Boneless on King Ella of Northumbria to avenge the death of his father, the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, the sagas present it not as a crime, but as a terrible honor. A human sacrifice dedicated to the god of war and death, Odin. The ritual they describe is one of almost unimaginable cruelty. A meticulous deconstruction of a living human being. The victim is restrained, forced down, their back exposed to the sky. First, the shape of an eagle with outstretched wings is carved deep into the skin with a blade. Then, the real work begins. Using a sword or a sharp knife, the executioner works his way down the spinal column, hooking the blade under each rib and severing it from the vertebrae, one by one. Imagine the sound of it, the wet snap of cartilage and the grating of steel on bone, repeated over and over. With the rib cage severed from the spine, the ribs are then forcibly bent outwards, breaking them again, creating a pair of bloody, protruding wings. But the final act is the one that gives the ritual its name and its unique, nauseating horror. The executioner reaches into the newly created cavity and pulls the victim's lungs out, laying them over the shoulder blades upon the wings. Some accounts claim salt was rubbed into the massive wounds. The sagas tell us that as the victim gasps their final breaths, the lungs inflate and deflate, fluttering in a way that supposedly resembles the gentle, final beating of an eagle's wings. It is the absolute summit of Viking cruelty, a masterpiece of ritualized pain designed to be the most agonizing and symbolically devastating death imaginable. It combines extreme physical torture with profound religious and personal humiliation. The sagas present it without question, a terrifying monument to the vengeance of heroes and the wrath of gods. The final word in a warrior's feud. The sagas present a story of ritualized vengeance. A horror so specific, so detailed, it feels like an eyewitness account. And for centuries, that's how it was treated, as a real, if rare, historical practice. It's the most infamous act of Viking brutality, but it has a secret. There is not one single piece of archaeological evidence this ever happened. In all the thousands of Viking-era graves and skeletons that have been unearthed, not one shows the markings of a blood eagle. Not one skeleton has its ribs severed from the spine from the back. It is a physical phantom, a ghost in the historical record. For years, scholars argued about the literary sources. But in 2022, a team of medical doctors and historians published a groundbreaking study in the academic journal Speculum. They didn't analyze the old texts. They analyzed the procedure itself. They moved the question from the library to the operating theater and asked a simple, brutal question. From a modern medical perspective, is the blood eagle even possible? Their answer was a definitive, unequivocal no. The study concluded that the victim would die almost instantly, not from the pain, but from basic anatomy. The moment the ribs are severed from the spinal column, major arteries that run alongside it would be severed, causing catastrophic blood loss and immediate shock. More importantly, the moment the thoracic cavity is breached from the back, both lungs would instantly collapse. It's a condition called bilateral pneumothorax. The victim would be unable to breathe, asphyxiating in a matter of seconds. The final, horrific flourish of the ritual, pulling the lungs out to create fluttering wings, is pure fantasy. The victim would be long dead before that could ever happen, their lungs deflated and useless. The ritual, as described in the sagas with such lurid detail, is an anatomical impossibility. The legend that has terrified millions is built on a medical fiction. So we are left with a chilling mystery. The most famous Viking punishment, the ultimate symbol of their savagery, almost certainly never happened. The question then becomes, why? Why invent such a specific, detailed, and anatomically impossible lie? Who created this story, and for what purpose? The answer reveals a different kind of warfare. One fought not with swords, but with stories. The answer to why the myth exists is not found in archaeology, but in power. Specifically, the power to write history. The accounts of the blood eagle that we have today were not written by the Viking executioners who supposedly performed it. They were written down centuries later, long after the Viking Age had ended, mostly by Christian authors describing their pagan ancestors and enemies. So, if it never happened, why does the story exist? The answer is a different kind of weapon. The myth was propaganda, a horror story crafted to turn Viking warriors into inhuman monsters. By painting their pagan foes as bloodthirsty savages capable of this kind of ritualistic butchery, it retroactively justified the often brutal campaigns of conversion and conquest against them. It's a classic tactic of war used throughout history. Dehumanize your enemy to make their destruction seem not only necessary, but righteous. The Blood Eagle was the ultimate character assassination, a fiction so powerful it has stained the reputation of an entire people for 1,000 years. Some scholars believe it may have started as something more subtle. Viking poetry was dense and complex, filled with metaphors called kennings. A phrase like, "to carve an eagle on a foe's back" may have simply been a poetic way of describing a warrior being killed in battle and left for the eagles and other carrion birds to feast upon. A brutal image, yes, but a conventional one in that warrior culture. It's entirely possible that later Christian writers, unfamiliar with these poetic rules, took the gruesome metaphor literally, and a legend was born from a simple misreading. Either way, a fiction was created. And isn't it fascinating what history chooses to remember? A lurid, impossible myth, a ghost story, becomes the enduring symbol of Viking culture. Meanwhile, the documented forensic reality of 54 humiliated men, butchered face to face and dumped in a pit in Dorset, is completely forgotten, paved over by a modern road and only rediscovered by accident. It reveals how power works. The story you tell is often more important and more lasting than the truth you bury. The blood eagle may be a lie, but it reveals a profound truth about the idea of humiliation. The fact that someone could invent such a ritual speaks volumes, whether it's a real execution designed to terrorize or a fictional story designed to demonize. Both come from the same dark impulse, the need to not just defeat an enemy, but to utterly annihilate their humanity. This impulse is far from ancient history. It's a part of who we are. That dark impulse to utterly unmake an enemy is the thread that connects everything we've seen. It's an echo from a brutal past that still resonates today, reminding us that the deepest wounds aren't always left by a blade. We began this journey in a pit of headless men, and we end with a truth far more profound than any single act of violence. From the clinical precision of the legal code that prescribed branding and castration to unman a criminal, to the raw, magical hatred of the cursed pole designed to break a person's spirit, the goal was always the same. We saw it in the methodical, face-to-face butchery at Ridgeway Hill, an act of mass humiliation designed to terrorize. The real weapon of the Viking Age wasn't the axe or the sword. It was shame, the fear of it, the surgical application of it, and the long, dark memory of it. It was a tool used to control populations, to enforce social order, and to wage a kind of war that targeted the soul. Even the blood eagle, the impossible myth, serves as a final chilling testament to this truth. The story itself became a weapon, a narrative tool of humiliation wielded by their enemies to posthumously brand an entire culture as monstrous. It proves that the battlefield for a person's reputation, for their very humanity, extends far beyond their lifetime. Fought by the authors who control the memory of the dead, the blood eagle may be a myth, but it teaches us that the most effective way to destroy people isn't always to break their bodies, but to control their story. To author their humiliation, and that is a horror far more real and far more timeless than any ancient legend.